Today's program is being brought to you by the voice studio of John Murrell. High quality and serious vocal training for the voice student. His studio is located on 6A in East Sandwich, and you're welcome to call him at 774-313-9012. The voice studio of John Murrell.
Welcome to another Cape Conversation. My name is Melinda Gallant, and I am here on Old County Road in East Sandwich, Massachusetts at the Just-in-Time Clock Shop. We're going to talk with John Hobbs, master clock repairer and maker and great guy. So come along, let's have a Cape Conversation on a beautiful March day on Cape Cod. Well, here I am sitting with the man about town who knows everything that's time. You're the Mad Hatter of Sandwich, I think, right? Because you're the time. I'm out of time. You've got the time. No?
Well, beware of anyone that tells you they know everything about something.
Just in time, actually, is what you are.
You are here,
yes.
Just in time, and welcome. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you. Well, we're sitting in your beautiful shop, and it is, it's outstanding. It's, all this beautiful sound around you. Does it ever drive you crazy?
It's a short putt driving me crazy.
But well, for all of us, John, for all of us.
No, after a while you don't even hear much of it.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. Just kind of, it's like when I drive home, from work, occasionally I don't know how I got there and I don't remember passing anything.
Yeah, could be.
So, a little bit like that. So tell me about this shop. How long have you been here?
Well, I guess we're going on our 12th year. It's been a labor of love for me for many years. I got into it as a teenager, but never was able to do it on a full-time basis until actually a little longer than 12 years ago. But
well, where did you grow up?
Oh, all over the place. That would take this interview and several more to tell you all the places I grew up.
Well, that's all right. Just where were you born? Were you born in Sandwich, Massachusetts?
I was born in Boston, actually.
Excellent.
Yes, indeed. And
in the Back Bay, perhaps?
The Boston Lying In Hospital.
There we go.
And no matter where we lived around the country, my family always came back to the Cape. My mother's family was from here. In fact, my grandfather, who got me started in clocks, was one of the last station masters in Woods Hole, and one of the clocks that he had was a clock that wouldn't run that came from the station. And so that was my first venture as a teenager. And the second venture was a clock that came off of one of the steamships out of Woods Hole, because people don't realize today that the railroad owned the steamship line. And my grandfather, being a perky fellow, he moved right along and he became a shaker and mover in the steamship operation. And World War II came along, and they took two huge steamers as troop ships, and he was presented with a ship's clock off the bridge of one of them. And lo and behold, by the time I came along as a teenager, that didn't work either. And so
he had him to fix these. Right?
Well, he didn't know I could fix anything from anything, but he was brave enough to let me fool around, and that got me started. So
that's wonderful. And what did you do? Have you done this all? Obviously you've done it as an avocation, and now it's your vocation. But have you always done this?
Often.
What did you have a real job?
Well, I guess my first real job was in the United States Marine Corps.
Oh my God! Oh, Semper Fi, once a Marine, always a Marine.
There you go.
Yeah.
But my first job after the service was with Hallmark Cards in downtown Boston, and I found another fellow at Hallmark with the love for clocks that I had, and the two of us discovered a school called the North Bennett Street Industrial Trade School. And so we went nights for 2 years and worked under a master Austrian watch and clock man. And so that was the extent of the formal training. But like so many things, you learn by doing, and that certainly describes this occupation.
Oh my goodness, that's wonderful. Well, we're sitting in chairs though, so you did go to the Virginia Military Institute?
The Virginia Military Institute.
Any politicians go there that you know of recently or anything?
Well, my Lord. Well, we have a lot of famous graduates, and I must quickly add that I'm not one of them, but General George C. Marshall.
Oh my goodness.
Was a VMI graduate. General Patton matriculated first at VMI and then went on to West Point, but always considered himself an alumnus of the Virginia Military Institute. And there's been loads and loads of people. And I'll just throw in quickly, I'm told that sometime in the 1920s, the United States Marine Corps tried to buy the Virginia Military Institute to make it the federal Marine Corps Academy, but the Commonwealth of Virginia would not sell it.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, well, they're, those stalwarts, right? Hang on.
There you go.
So how long have you been in this location? How long have you lived in Sandwich?
Oh, we've lived here since 1981, right here on this spot, and that's how long we've been in Sandwich.
And this is how long you've had the shop here as well?
No, as I said, we've been open now we're in our 12th year.
12th year.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So tell me a little bit as I look around this room. You've got so many interesting clocks. I mean, there's one back in the corner back here that's an Art Deco clock. I would call it Art Deco. You'd call it something else, I think.
Well,
it's got a name. I think you told me the name. Of course, I have a mind like a sieve, so I don't remember the name.
Well, I'm not sure I do either, but it is maybe you would like to take a look at it before you leave and show the audience. But it is a clock that has tubes as opposed to chime bars. It is a clock that exposes the movement so that you can see everything happen in real time. You can see the rack and the tail of the rack as it falls on the snail, and all this is Greek to tell you that that's how the clock knows when it's going to chime and do its melody and when it's going to strike and how many is it going to strike. So.
And it's so interesting to look at. And the other thing too is, and next to us here, there seems to be a lot of standing tall clocks that I would call a grandfather clock. Now tell me, why would I call it a grandfather clock?
Well, probably because you're familiar with a tune called My Grandfather's Clock. And My Grandfather's Clock at one time was a most popular tune, I guess both in Great Britain and in the United States. Mm-hmm. And no one knows for sure now whether it referred to a clock on the wall, a mantel clock, or a tall case clock. And that is what a grandfather's clock is, first and foremost. It's a floor clock called a tall case clock. It can be of any varying height. But once that tune, My Grandfather's Clock, mm-hmm. came out, common usage referred to tall case clocks as a grandfather clock. And then as time went by, one that wasn't quite so tall got the name of a grandmother's clock. And so sometimes we have them that are maybe that far off the floor, and someone will call them a granddaughter clock. So.
Oh, how cute. That's great. That's great.
Take your choice.
Now, do you do custom work for people?
Well, I try to make every undertaking I take a custom effort for my client, but I think you're referring to, do we make an individual clock? And
yes,
the answer to that would be no.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking.
No. We do a lot of repair. In fact, in recent years, that's become our mainstay, is the repair and maintenance of clocks. We are indeed a factory repair center for most of the major brands. We don't expect people to bring a tall case clock in over their shoulder to us to be repaired, so our schedule allows for a time to go to the client's mm-hmm. home, and we will remove the movement, the weights, and the pendulum, where we bring them back here. There's a couple over on the other side of the shop that are mm-hmm. running now, waiting to go back to their home, and we go through them thoroughly, clean, oil. People oftentimes don't realize that your clock requires care as well. And I can give you a quick rundown on why that's the case, but I know you have limited time, so.
Well, but actually, though, you wouldn't think. I mean, it's like any other. It has moving parts. So if it has moving parts, I would think it would have to be oiled and dusted and cleaned, and because it would get gunk.
I think the best way to understand it is a quick analogy. Say you painted your room in an oil-based paint.
Yep.
And you went away for a day or two, and you came back, and the paint's all nice and dry and hard and shiny, and you say, gosh, what happened to the oil in my oil-based paint? Well, what happened, Melinda, is that it dried. And when oil dries, it turns to varnish. And varnish is a very hard substance. Now, on a wall, that's great. Great in the first instance because you want it to dry quickly so mm-hmm. dust doesn't settle in it while it's drying.
Sure.
But in a clock, we want just the opposite. We want a very slow drying oil. We don't want it to dry hard. Now, the fact that the clock is running...
So you don't use WD-40, I presume?
Oh, don't use WD-40 on a clock. You know what WD stands for?
No.
Water dispersant.
Oh.
It can glue up the inside of your clock faster than you can say Jiminy Cricket.
Okay, there you go. There you go. A little known fact.
So you want to use a very fine oil. You do not oil the gears, you only oil the pivots and the verge, and I won't get off into what all that is, but it's all part of the clock. Mm-hmm. But no matter how good a housekeeper you are, there's always dust in the air.
Oh, sure.
Dust and oil combine, and it forms a paste. and after a while it's like driving a car with the brakes on. And here's the thing. The clock doesn't have the ability to have increased power, except maybe to wind it up a little stronger or a little less, but unlike your car where you come to the hill and you step on the gas and right over the top.
Right.
Well, in a clock, you can start to have this abrasion form between dust and dried oil or varnish, and if the clock continues to run with that, it can turn a round hole into a pear-shaped hole.
Which would really...
This is not good.
Yeah.
So,
it's true.
the good news is that maybe 90-95% of the time the clock will just stop running before any real damage is done. But that's when you want to see your friendly clock man and have it cleaned and oiled.
Now, you were telling me that there's always been a clockmaker in Sandwich, or a clock repairman, or a clock shop.
Well, let me not talk like I'm the local historian, but to my knowledge, there's been at least 3 generations of people in town who have been employed in clock repair, clock sales, what have you. And so it does seem to be somewhat of a tradition in this neck of the woods, and I'm happy to carry it on.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, you also showed me a clock that had, you called it almost the closest thing to a perpetual clock that you can get.
Well, perpetual motion, and I think you're
motion,
referring
yes.
to what's called an Atmos clock.
Yes.
And that is a clock that has a bladder that expands and contracts, and by virtue of that bladder expanding and contracting, it rewinds the clock more or less automatically. But since we all know there's really no such thing as a perpetual motion clock, what will eventually happen is the clock mechanism will need to be cleaned and oiled in the manner and for the reason that I explained earlier.
Yeah.
So that's where the perpetual motion kind of comes to it needs some help. But it's a very interesting clock. And in fact, it's more like a watch than a clock.
Is that right?
Yes. There's more precision in a clock. More precision in a watch than a clock for the most part, because you're dealing with much smaller parts. Which reminds me I always like to point out the fact that people think of clocks in Switzerland. No, Switzerland is watches. Germany are clocks.
Clocks, I see.
And so there's a little difference there, even though they're in the same part of the world. But any clock that has a hairspring rather than a pendulum, when the Atmos you do have a pendulum, it's just a pendulum that turns in the horizontal rather than back and forth. But any involved timepiece that has a hairspring rather than a pendulum is really a watch rather than a clock, and it's something of a different discipline.
I see. And you have clocks here that can play everything from Pachelbel canon or something, Beethoven's whatever, and I mean, that's kind of amazing to me. How do the clock makers get them to have them strike, the strikers to hit? I mean, how does the clock know to do that? It's not the clock doesn't know to do that, but how does the clockmaker?
Well, we all learn.
Is it arranging the gears?
When you go to clock school, you learn a language, and then you talk to the clock and hum it a tune, and pretty soon it picks it right up.
And it picks it up right there. We go. Okay.
No,
I knew it was magical. I knew it.
Well, first of all, there are some tunes that lend themselves in cadence to the clock. The most common and most well-known is the Westminster chime from Westminster Abbey in London. Then you have another English tune that's quite commonly heard called Whittington. That has a few more notes in it than Westminster. Then after that, you might have, and I'll give you a little challenge here. Can you tell me the name of the only clock chime that is native to North America? And I'll even give you a hint. It plays to this very day in a clock in Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay.
I know you're going to say St. Michael's, and you're right. Congratulations.
Oh my gosh! And I was going to say my old Kentucky home, but anyway, okay. I think he doesn't think I know anything about clocks. Trust me.
Oh, I think you know quite a bit.
I can shake my wrist. That's how I wind this one.
You know the one that you want to take home with you. I think that's nice.
Yeah, that's true. I do.
Well, anyway, I guess way before my time, but some very smart people categorized and able to break it into sections so that you have 1 bar on the 15, 2 on the half, 3 on the 3/4, all 4 bars on the hour, and it was all symmetrical and presented nicely. There are some others. There's Ave Maria, for example, and you mentioned Beethoven's Ode to Joy, which is a very nice sounding one and is in special clocks. And there are others besides, but those are the best known. So that's it on chimes, I guess.
That's all there is to say about chimes. Well, and they've been chiming and going off the whole time here, which is kind of interesting, you know. And again, you say that you don't even hear them anymore.
Well, you don't notice them after a while.
And that
they're
ticking.
They're
Tick.
ticking away. There goes one now.
Right.
It's just there, and you're conscious of it, and you know what time it's telling you or where you are within the hour. And so it's like having a presence. Having a clock in your household is like having another person there with you. It's very comforting. That's one of the things that I often hear from people, that it's like having a friend in the home with them.
Sure. Now, what's the most unusual clock you've ever worked on?
The one I couldn't fix.
Okay.
A most unusual clock. Well, there's so many out there. I think my first reaction to something like that is a clock with a story. And what do I mean by that? I mean a provenance. Sometimes you discover it in the clock by virtue of people having marked where they were when they worked on the clock and a date. I remember one from Nantucket that had been repaired in Mattapoisett every 2 years for 8 years, I think it was, and I could see that in the clock. The owner,
So they wrote in pencil?
No, they scribed on the movement.
Oh, they scribed.
Sometimes
on the
they
movement.
would write in pencil on the case.
Yeah, that's what I was
and often you'll find pieces of information like that. And we encourage people, no matter when you got your clock, to just start, sit down and write everything you know about it. If it's a clock that's come through the family, just take a small piece of paper and sit down and write it all down. Who had it? Where was it? Physically, where was it? Everything and anything you know. It actually adds value to a clock, and it's a very interesting thing to do.
That's kind of interesting. You know, it brings to mind to me, I grew up in the Midwest, and my mother was part of a family they were oil people in Oklahoma, and owned oil wells and whatever, and they did quite well, and they were quite successful at drilling oil fields. And we had some clock. We never had a standing clock, but we had a lot of what I'm going to call, they were kind of swoopy clocks with wood, you know, and we had ones that were made with marble, with you know, that were made out of marble, very almost Art Deco in look to me now, I would call it that, I'm sure it was, but they were all from the early 1900s and whatever. Unfortunately, when my mother passed, my older siblings, those kinds of things went to them, but they never could get them. My mother always used to yell that she could never get it fixed. I mean, never could get it just right, and they would never really. They were so old, I guess, so old, and probably needed so much
Well, let me
work.
tell you the most common reason for that complaint, and it's called putting your clock in beat. Putting your clock in beat means that you have the most even sounding tick that you can possibly get. Not tick-tock, not tock-tick, but a nice even tick-tock. The old-timers' trick on achieving that, it's easy if it's on a clock on the wall. You could just take your clock and move it on its swivel just a little to the right or a little to the left and listen to the difference in the tone of the tick. Well, you can achieve the same thing with a mantle or a shelf clock by putting a folded piece of paper on two legs of one side, and you change it, and you change how the clock sounds, okay? A clock that is not in beat will almost always stop within a relatively short period of time. So that's the first thing. I won't say throw your level out, but you level a clock, not with a carpenter's level, but by your ear.
Is that right?
That's probably the best advice I can give anyone
I'll
who's
call my
having
sister
trouble.
in San Francisco and let her know that.
What are you going to call her?
I'm going to call her and tell her that her clock needs leveling.
Okay.
With her ear, not with anything
There
else.
you go.
There, that's perfect. That's perfect. So you've been here for 12 years. You've lived in Sandwich since 1981. How do you feel about the community of Sandwich being here?
Gee, I think
as a
I'll stay.
business? You think you'll stay?
I think I
That's
will,
good,
yes.
Yeah. I feel the same way. I came in '80s, so.
Well, we'd all like to see our taxes lower, and I won't get into the political arena, but we have much to be grateful here.
Yes, we do.
Here.
We do. And you are located on Old County Road, which is, geez, one of the most scenic roads in all of the town. I think it is so lovely, and you just come off of 6A and right past Tickums, drive past Tickums, take.
Well, we're very
Old County
accessible
Road
whether you're coming off the Mid-Cape Highway.
Well, that's true. You can go that way too.
At exit 4
Yeah.
on the other end of Old County Road, off of Chase Road,
Yeah.
or off of 6A. Yes, I think the old custom was that the clockmaker was where you found him, and he most likely was in the countryside rather than in the village. But we're happy to be here, and don't forget that this was at one time a very thriving village here in East Sandwich, just down the end of the property here. And I rather imagine that Old County Road is kind of shorthand for the Old Kings Highway as we know it in Barnstable and environs. And since the road by the Riverview School and over Scorton Creek didn't exist until the 20s,
Right.
and since the railroad bed tends to follow us here, I think you're sitting on a road that has been in use since way pre-revolutionary times.
Oh,
It
sure,
was the
sure.
straight up and down the Cape. So
Right.
I'm sure that there must have been
The
many a
original
sign,
cart path.
many a sign along here. Stop here and buy a clock.
Well, and I notice that you have one out there now. Stop, it's time for that, right? Just stop in time. Now, John, we're standing here in front of a very unusual looking clock, and this is called a
Banjo clock.
banjo clock because it looks like a
Banjo, which
There
is
we
the
go.
only musical instrument, as I understand it, that was original to the United States. And back about the time of the War of 1812, a very famous clockmaker named Simon Willard looked at the banjo shape and said, after building so many tall case regulator clocks, which are weight-driven clocks, he said, you know what? I can take this shape, this banjo shape, and I can disguise a weight in the throat of it. And I can have a regulator clock for people. Now you say, why is it important to have a regulator clock? Understand that a regulator clock is a clock that is only run by a weight. And since the power to this regulator clock is always the same, whether it's wound up or it's wound down, the time is constant. And you can regulate the time so exactly, probably the best timekeeper around,
Is that right?
regulator clock.
A regulator
okay?
clock.
So he built this clock, or a clock like it, and typically you had a very interesting scene here that is hand-painted, reverse painted glass.
well, that which is kind of amazing to me.
Yes,
And it
and
has a pendulum, but made it a regulator. Is that right?
no.
No.
A pendulum, any clock has a pendulum unless it
see.
uses a hairspring, in which case it has no pendulum.
I gotcha.
But usually the photo, or I shouldn't say photo, the painting that is here is the USS Constitution. Because don't forget, the War of 1812 was a very important and very interesting time frame, and people commemorated that by usually having a painting of the Constitution or one of the other vessels of the new United States Navy on the glass. But let's talk about what happened to this clock for the most part. You'll see that this clock has two winding arbors here. Now, that means that one almost always is going to be the time, and one is almost always going to be the strike. Well, Simon Willard, when he made this originally as a regulator clock and had a weight up here, there was only one winding arbor, which would be about where my finger is, and you could tell immediately that it was a regulator clock, a weight-driven clock, because it didn't strike. It only had the one place to wind it. But here's what happened. People said, oh, it's wonderful that it's a regulator clock, but why doesn't it strike?
Oh.
And Simon Willard, in his infinite wisdom, said, well, yes, we could make it strike, or somebody could make it strike, but we'd have to take the weight out. So guess what? They took the weight out, and now it was no longer a regulator clock. If it had to be wound up with a spring,
Makes it a spring, right.
it's no longer a regulator clock, because when the spring is all the way wound up, it has more power than when it's almost wound down, doesn't it?
Yes.
So it would run, in the normal course of events, faster when it was wound up and a little slower
when
as it
it's
wound
wound
down, which defeated the whole purpose of a regulator clock. which is why you would have at least one regulator clock in your home, so you could regulate all the
rest
other
of the
clocks around the house.
That's too funny.
Because it might be a month before you went to town and saw the clock on the top of the courthouse or up
And
at
by
the
the
church.
time you got home, it'd be a different time.
It could be. So that,
And were they always as ornate as this?
not necessarily, no.
This is very ornate. It's very,
Yeah.
kind of Greek looking.
This particular one was made by the Chelsea Clock Company many years ago, but they were made by a number of makers. Simon Willard was the most famous and the first, but the New Haven Clock Company, Sessions Clock Company, Ingram Clock Company, there were lots of clock companies that made these, but they were mostly not regulator clocks. They were
I see.
mostly wind-up
Winding.
clocks. So that's the story on the
Excellent.
banjo clock. American banjo clock is a classic.
It is. It is a classic. And John, you are a classic.
Well, keep it up. Flattery will get you everywhere.
No, I'm serious. To have somebody like you with such a craft and such a skill in our community, we're very, very fortunate to have you here. And I hope everybody stops by. I mean, it would be lovely if everybody comes by and buys a nice big standing clock. But it would be nice just to have people stop in and see what a beautiful job you've done here, and how beautiful your, I'm going to call it a gallery, a clock gallery.
Well,
what
interestingly
it
enough,
is.
if you look in the rear of the shop, up on the top, you'll
Yeah.
see we have a designation of being the Howard Miller Gallery, which is something we're proud to have.
And Howard Miller is?
Howard Miller is one of the premier clock
Clock-
makers in the United
Excellent.
States.
Excellent. And you carry those clocks?
We do.
Excellent, excellent. John,
Thank you so much for coming by.
thank you. Well, thank you for joining me today here at Just in Time Clock Shop on Old County Road in Sandwich, Massachusetts, actually East Sandwich, Massachusetts. Wasn't John Hobbs absolutely fascinating? He is a true craftsman and a gentleman as well. So come along next time and let's have a Cape conversation.